Yeah, check it.
All right, can you hear me? It's turned on my end. Do you need to pair? There's a pair button on this thing.
Definitely on.
Yeah.
Oh, wait.
So you get me now?
That sound.
So are we up and going? Do what?
I'm gonna see if I can hear you.
Okay. If you sent that link in that
I did.
Skype, she'll probably tell you also if she can hear me or not. All right. So once we can confirm that the link is out, we'll give people a minute or two and then we'll go ahead. All right, we got it sent out? Perfect. So we've got a new link to a new live stream. The nice thing is the link will be there to go back and watch later. So anybody who tried to do the first one and it didn't work, we'll be able to send it to them and they'll be able to watch it later. So for anybody who is watching online, just so you know, there was a little hiccup with YouTube and the way this is streaming. Apparently when you pre-schedule a live video, it doesn't work exactly the same as when you do it when you just go live on the fly. So now that we know that, we will not do that again, but here we are. So I'm going to not spend a lot of time on an introduction, especially since we don't have a lot of time left because we cut a decent chunk out of the beginning, but also I'll talk a little bit more about myself at the end. So I'll just let you know that in case you didn't know, my name is Brad Boring, and we're going to talk about dragons. So let's just go ahead and jump right into it. So we can go ahead and switch the slides. We'll get this down, I promise. It'll get smoother. We were all prepared for one scenario, and we got a little curveball here. So I'll go ahead and start talking. The slide will be up in a second. Basically, dragons are obviously not real, right? They're not things that actually exist. You can't like go to the zoo and see one, or like, you know, go to the rainforest and see one. Yet they exist in almost every culture that there ever has been. So these cultures that don't talk to each other, they weren't Facebook friends, they don't know each other, but somehow managed to come up with this same creature with a lot of very similar attributes. Not all exactly the same, but go ahead, Todd. So we have a picture of a Chinese dragon. This is from the Greek, so they had their own version of a dragon. Go ahead, Todd. This is European, so this is a statue somewhere in Europe. This is from Croatia. So you can see all of this is Smaug, actually, if you're a Lord of the Rings fan. Go ahead. If you're a fan of How to Train Your Dragon, you might know Toothless. If you're not a fan of How to Train Your Dragon, you should be. I mean, in terms of like kids movies or like animated movies, it's up there with like Toy Story and Lion King, I promise. If you haven't seen it, go watch it. And then there's Trogdor as well. If you're not familiar with Homestar Runner, you should familiarize yourself with that too. So the question is, how does this creature get created in all of these different places, in all these different cultures, when there's no connection between any of them? It wasn't like a committee of people that sat down and said, let's make up this crazy new thing that we can all use in our stories and tell, you know, myths about for generations. But yet it happened, right? So the question is, where do dragons come from? At least that's where I start, right? So let's talk about where dragons come from. So there is a theory. There are actually more than a couple. There are a lot of theories. I'll talk about a couple of them right now. One of them is that the dragon is a composite creature. So even though we know it doesn't exist, we kind of created this thing in our minds that is a combination of a few other creatures that do exist. So you've got the cat or a tree cat, the bird or the snake, sorry, and the bird, right? So the theory goes that there were these three creatures that are basically the most scary or the most predatory in development of early humans. So they lived in forests, they lived in jungles, and so they had to protect themselves. So the things that you were the most likely to get injured or killed by were one of these three things: a snake, a tree cat, or a bird. And so what they did was basically, instead of going out on their journeys prepared to fight any one of these three, they just kind of invented this being that represents all three, so that when they're traveling, if they're prepared to kill a dragon, then they're prepared to kill any of these, right? So that's kind of the theory. There's actually, it comes from a book called An Instinct for Dragons, I think it's called, by a guy named, I shouldn't try to say his name because I can't remember off the top of my head, David something, but you can look it up. And this is basically his theory. This comes from his research, and he's an anthropologist. So he just looked at kind of the things that scare people as well as other primates. So primates being, monkeys and apes and things. Actually, monkeys, they have three distinct warning calls. So they have like a sound that they make to warn other monkeys of danger. They have three distinct calls. One of them is for snakes, one of them is for birds, and one of them is for cats. So pretty interesting idea. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but interesting nonetheless. This idea that we kind of created this whole thing based out of the things that we fear the most. And whether this theory is accurate or not, I think there's another theory that also makes sense, but I think they both come from the idea of fear. So let's talk about the other theory. So we start with snakes. So more kind of details about snakes, for those of you who are super into like biology and stuff. Snakes are something that we're innately afraid of. So if you think that you're not afraid of snakes, you're wrong. You are. We all are. It's built into us as human beings. We're afraid of snakes. There's been lots of studies that have tested that, and lots of theories about kind of why that is. But there are lots of things that we know that help us understand that better. So one is our vision. So actually, humans can spot snakes before they can spot pretty much anything else. So they've done these studies where there's like a snake and it's in like a background that's really blurry, and they kind of gradually make it less and less blurry until the snake is completely visible. And they do this with lots of pictures, spiders, just random household objects. And then they tested lots of people, and they looked at these pictures and watched them change, and they recognized snakes. They knew it was a picture of a snake before they could recognize any other objects or any other animals. So there was also a theory called snake detection theory, which actually says that humans and snakes evolved together, and that's why our eyesight is as good as it is. So it's not just that we detect them, but actually that our eyes, kind of compared to most other animals, are on the front of our head, and we can kind of put images together the best out of all the animals because you had to do that to survive. Generally because of snakes is the theory. There was actually Charles Darwin, who's kind of the father of evolutionary theory, right? He had this idea to try to kind of test that and to prove that he wasn't afraid of snakes. So he actually went to a zoo, and he wrote about this, so you can go look it up. He went to a zoo, and he stood in front of a snake, the glass in front of a snake cage, and just put his face up to it and waited, I think it was a cobra, but I could be wrong, for it to strike. And over again, trying to force himself to not jump back, and he couldn't do it. Completely incapable of stopping himself from jumping back. And his theory, which that's obviously not super scientific, this is just Darwin testing himself, but his theory was that snake fear was innate, and that was a long time before kind of these more modern philosophies about snakes. So again, this all comes back to fear. So we've got snakes as something that we all fear innately, and then we add wings, right? So if you think of snakes, another thing that I didn't mention about kind of our vision in snakes is that the color that we see the most shades of is green. I don't know if you knew that or not. So if you think about like the color spectrum, you can see different shades of all those colors. Green is the one you see the most shades of. And so obviously there's correlation there as well. If you think about like a snake in the grass, you got to be able to point it out, right? So if you think about the snake in the grass and the idea that, obviously snakes are scary, but anybody who's ever kind of seen or been around a snake, there are obviously ways to protect yourselves, right? I mean, you can either step on it if you're fast enough and you get it in the right spot, or stab it, or pick it up behind its head or whatever and talk to a camera about it if you have an Australian accent. But the one thing that would make snakes less capable of taken care of is if it could fly away, right? So you take this thing that is the scariest thing that we all are afraid of because it's built into us as human beings, and then you say, okay, now it can escape. Now it can get away, and so now it's even scarier because now we don't have a way to stop it. And then you add to that fire, which obviously is pretty much the most destructive force that there is, especially if you're thinking about early humans, right, where these stories are starting to develop. So you've got the scariest thing you've ever seen in your life, then you stick wings on it so it can fly and get away from you. Now you have no control. Oh, by the way, it can also breathe fire and destroy everything you've ever had, right? So the idea of dragons and where they come from is that they represent fear, okay? So I know that the talk was called Slaying Dragons, and some of you, I talked to you and tried to convince you to come and told you about how we were going to talk about slaying dragons. So we're not really going to go in depth about the exact technique of how to get the angle and get behind and take it out. But the idea is that we need to understand what dragons represent, and that's fear. Okay, so the idea is that what we're talking about is not so much killing these mythical creatures, but taking down the fear that prevents us from doing the things that we either want to do or feel like we're pulled to do or called to do or are capable of doing, right? The biggest thing that prevents us from achieving significant things in our lives is because of fear, right? So that could be fear of failure, fear of what other people might say, fear that it's not going to work out like you wanted to. But a lot of times it all comes down to fear, and that is what the dragon represents. And not just fear, right? Because we all have fear. We all fear the snakes. But then you basically multiply that, right, by the wings, and then multiply it again by the fire, and you've got almost crippling fear, right? So that's what we're going to actually talk about, is how do we defeat that, okay? And so my own personal philosophy, and what I'm going to try to basically convince you of from here on out, is that defeating the dragon is done by dreaming, okay? So dreams are these ideas that we have in our heads about what we want to do, who we want to be, where we want to go in life. And all of those things, generally speaking, are things that also don't exist, right? So while it's easy to kind of say, well, dragons aren't real, so why are we afraid of these fictional things? Well, that's a good point, right? So dreaming is about something that also isn't real, right? It's about identifying a place and time that doesn't exist yet, generally speaking, and then using that kind of imagination to overcome the imaginary fears that exist at the same time. And so that's what we're talking about. And if you're not really following this, think about the movie Happy Gilmore, if you've ever seen that movie. So Happy, whenever he gets frustrated, right? Chubbs tells him to go to his happy place, and so he always thinks about this happy place with everything's white, and Chubbs is playing the piano, and he has his hand. If you haven't seen Happy Gilmore, you may not be following this, but you definitely should. But everything's great, right? But then what happens when things start to go bad? What happens to his happy place? His own fantasy becomes horrible, right? And Shooter's there, and everybody's in black, and he kind of takes over. But that's what we're kind of talking about. So it's this whole kind of struggle that goes on within yourself, not something that you can see. You're not actually going out into the woods and slaying a dragon. You're doing all of this fighting and all of this overcoming fears and challenging the things that are hard for you, all within your own head, right? So that's the idea. So let's go to the next one. I didn't talk about this when I talked about snakes specifically, but you may be familiar with what this is depicting. This is a snake, and that's Eve. So in the Bible, in the tradition for many religions, there's a story about the snake in the garden who tempts the first human beings to sin or to kind of do what they were explicitly told not to do, right? And so there are lots of, you could debate it's almost like a chicken and an egg thing, right? Like, are people afraid of snakes because the snake is what tempted us in the garden? Or did the story about the snake arise because of our fear of them? Doesn't really matter either way, but there's definitely correlation there, okay? This quote that I have down here, it says, you see things and you say, why? But I dream things that never were, and I say, why not? So this is actually spoken by the snake in a play called Back to Methuselah. So it's written by George Bernard Shaw. And so the idea here is the snake is trying to convince Eve, who is, like the second human being ever made. So she's not like, super intelligent, and I shouldn't say she's not intelligent. She doesn't have the benefit of the thousands of years of knowledge that we all have, right? So the snake is trying to convince her that eating this apple from this tree that she was specifically told not to eat is not so bad, right? And what he's trying to tell her is that, hey, you don't know what's going to happen, so trust me. I know how this works. I know things you don't, right? And so the way I actually came across this, so I've never actually read the whole play, and I'm not like a huge George Bernard Shaw fan, but actually I came across this quote because I was looking up a different quote that I actually wanted to share with you, which was by Robert F. Kennedy. So Robert F. Kennedy was actually, this is Robert F. Kennedy, by the way. He's the younger brother of JFK, who was the president. Robert Kennedy was the attorney general for JFK, and then he ran for president, but got killed before he actually got to finish his race. So, but when he was running and when he was well known in politics, this was a quote that he said quite frequently, okay? He said, some men see things as they are and ask why. I dream things that never were and ask why not, right? And it's a little bit confusing, and it's like, why would anybody ever talk that way? First of all, he's a Kennedy, so you kind of have to think through that lens. But he was using these words from the snake in the garden from Back to Methuselah, which I didn't know. I was like, this is a cool quote about dreaming that I want to use in this talk. So I went and Googled it, and I realized that apparently Robert Kennedy was a huge George Bernard Shaw fan. And so he took this quote, and this is what I love about this, and this is why I use this quote specifically in this whole story in this talk. Because he took what is the fear, right? He took what created this fear in us, this fear of snakes, the most common thing that we all are afraid of, and he took and used his same words and twisted it to talk about how to overcome those exact same fears, right? So Robert Kennedy is doing right here exactly what I'm kind of talking about doing, right? You take the thing that you're afraid of, and then you say, look, this is only fear. This only scares me. This is only a fear because because I'm imagining this bad thing happening, and I haven't yet put into place in my own thoughts something that overcomes that fear, right? So actually, this was obviously not part of my talk because I didn't know this was going to happen, but a good example is one of the things that I could have, thought about coming into this is, what if this doesn't work? What if the technology doesn't work? What if we get here and we can't live stream? What if everything doesn't work, right? So one of the things that we did, Todd and I did last week, was come in here and test it all, make sure it all works, right? So those are ways that I can, in my own life, in my own process, set myself up to overcome the things that I was afraid might happen by doing everything I can to prevent them, right? And so Kennedy here is talking about seeing these things that don't yet exist, but saying, why not, right? So kind of moving from Kennedy to my own life, even though I already gave you one example from my own life, I wanted to tell a little bit about my daughter. So she's 5, and about a year and a half ago, maybe, when she was 3, she wasn't going to sleep. She was in bed, waiting for her to go to sleep, and she just was up there screaming, whatever, didn't want to go to sleep. So I went up there and talked to her, and she always liked to tell stories. That was always like her argument. Like, well, can I stay up and tell stories? Okay, fine. Because with 3-year-old kids, they don't tell stories for very long. They start telling stories and then they fall asleep, right? But her argument, or her kind of predicament, was that when she told stories, they were just bad guys, right? She was kind of doing the Happy Gilmore thing. She was telling this story, and then they kept turning into bad stories. Bad guys kept showing up in her story. She couldn't get rid of them, right? And so we had this whole long talk, which my wife still to this day believes I was being manipulated by a 3-year-old, that she was just trying to use this as an excuse to stay up even later. But I don't believe that. So we had this whole conversation about, well, what are your stories? You're the one making them up. You control what happens, right? If you have a story where something bad happens, then make something good happen. And she wasn't quite grasping that. And she was talking about how she couldn't fight the bad guys. They were bad guys and she couldn't fight them. And I'm like, well, then add people to your story who can fight them. Who are people that can fight? And she started naming her friends and her cousins and her grandpa. And I'm like, okay, so then how do you, so they're in the story now. So now you can make a story about how you beat them, but they don't have weapons. And so like she had a kind of a comeback for everything. So actually what I ended up doing was getting her a sword. So a little plastic sword from the toy store that she actually has slept with ever since then, in her bed, that she keeps with her, because at night when she starts to get afraid, she grabs a sword and she remembers that she can actually beat them herself. So she doesn't need anybody else. She doesn't need me and my wife to come comfort her. She certainly isn't allowed in our bed. So she has to sit up there and figure out how to overcome that. And that's what she does. And so I actually have a picture of her with the sword that I wanted to show you. So this is her, 5 now. So this is a couple years after the original incident, but the same sword. So now she's pretty confident, as you can see, wielding the sword and slaying the dragons and kind of ready to storm the castle there. So I love that example, partially because it's my kid, right? And how you kind of have to love your own kids. But also because I think that's a perfect representation of kind of what we're talking about in slaying our dragons. And I've kind of been talking to her a little bit about using her for this, and I had to obviously get her to pose in front of a green screen to make this work. And so when I was explaining to her why we were doing this, I was telling her about, kind of this talk and what I was doing. And she was pretty she said, yeah, you can teach other people how to slay dragons like you taught me, because I'm not afraid of the dark anymore. Now I'm not afraid, right? And all because she just, in her own mind, realized that she was capable of overcoming those things that scared her, okay? I think I don't know if the next slide or okay, so here's heroes. So this is the idea. We're all familiar with this, right? We all understand dragons. We saw some examples of dragons, but here are examples of heroes like, Rocky, you've got William Wallace, Simba, Enrique Iglesias. So these are heroes that we're familiar with in culture, right? We understand this idea of a hero. And we understand when you watch these movies, when you see these stories, you watch them do what? They overcome the things that they're afraid of, right? I mean, how many of these movies, if you just think through, I'm thinking of like Rocky, and he's got his trainer that's telling him that he can do these things that he didn't think he could do. You think of Rudy, and there's the guy, the groundskeeper at the stadium at Notre Dame, who convinces him that he is capable of doing this, even when he didn't think he could. Obviously, Simba has to get some sense talked into him by Nala, right? So everybody has these scenarios where they feel like they can't do it, where they feel like it's not really possible, and they overcome that. And when we see that played out in literature or in movies or in our own lives of people that we know, we relate to that, right? We celebrate that. That's why these people are considered heroes. They wouldn't be heroes if they let the thing that scared them hold them back. If they let the thing that made them kind of think that maybe this wasn't possible, keep them from even trying in the first place, right? And because they tried, because they set out to accomplish something that wasn't guaranteed, they became the hero, and that's how we become the hero, right? And so let me give you some more examples of how this works in real life, because obviously fiction's great, it inspires us, it makes us feel good, but it's still fiction, right? Even these stories that are based on true stories like Rudy, we know that Hollywood kind of manipulates a little bit to make it a little bit more inspirational, right? So let's talk about a good real life example. So this is Martin Luther King Jr. Hopefully you know that. But he gave probably the most famous speech that's ever been given about dreams, right? We all kind of know this. So he had this line in that speech: I have a dream that my 4 children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, right? So hopefully everyone is well aware of the context of this speech and these words, but put yourself in 1960s America. Segregation still exists. There are still a lot of racial tension, and especially in the South, where Martin Luther King Jr. spent a lot of his time. He saw this firsthand. So this world where people were judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin was hard for anybody to see. It was hard to believe that it could even exist, right? Nobody knew what a world like that in the southern United States in the 1960s even looked like. There was no concept in people's minds of how this thing could be possible, right? So what Martin Luther King did, and I love that he actually used the word dream because it kind of fits so perfectly, but he defined exactly what it was, right? So that's the first thing kind of about accomplishing any of these things. We talked about the heroes and all those stories, but it all comes from this idea that you know, Martin Luther King did it, but we can all do it in our own lives. We start with, here's the dream. Here's what it is. He defined it specifically, even though there was no evidence that it ever was going to exist. There was no clear path of how you get there, right? But he said it, and he said it boldly, and he said it with conviction because he believed it, right? And obviously he didn't live long enough to see it play out. And obviously not everything is solved in with regard to race relations in America, but it's a heck of a lot better than it was in the 1960s, right? And he played a big part in it. And one of the biggest things that he played, besides kind of being on the ground and talking to people who were in it and marching and leading all those things, was this speech, right? I mean, if you think about Martin Luther King, you might think of, you know, Letter to Birmingham Jail that he wrote. You might think of him marching with the, what were they, garbage workers in Memphis, which was where he died when they were union workers, and they were picketing, and they were protesting the wages and things. But most likely, if you hear Martin Luther King Jr., the first thing you think of is the speech, right? So why is a speech the most significant thing that you think of for a person who actually did all of these real actions, right? Because before any actions happen, you have to put real ideas to it, okay? You can't act on something that hasn't yet been defined. You can't move toward a goal that doesn't exist. So Martin Luther King defined a goal, a clear goal that he imagined, right? That he saw in his mind that nobody else saw, right? Everybody else saw dragons, right? Everybody else saw why it wouldn't work. Everybody else saw the things that we were afraid of all along. That's why change is always really hard, because we know what's working, at least for the people who have the power, right? So changing that means overcoming some fear that maybe it doesn't work out exactly like you thought, even if you define it clearly, okay? So that's the kind of transition, I guess. I know we've transitioned a little bit and talked about dreams a lot, but this is how we overcome dragons. Okay, so it's not a sword, even though my daughter still thinks that, and don't tell her that that's not true. But it's not, you know, learning how to physically fight or face your fears or stand at the glass and wait for the snake. It's just defining what you want to do and having conviction about it and being clear and believing. I mean, notice he doesn't say in here that, like, I have a dream that maybe if we're lucky, or maybe if everything works out just right, my kids. No, he said, this is what it is, and this is what's going to happen. Okay, so I have another kind of slide about this kind of same idea. I won't read the whole thing, but this is a poem called Invictus. And honestly, so I told you before, I was kind of researching this and came across the Robert Kennedy, well, knew the Robert Kennedy quote, came across the background, George Bernard Shaw, and Back to Methuselah. I actually wasn't thinking about this talk at all. I was just listening to a podcast that I like, and this poem came up. So I went and looked it up, and I was like, I have to include that because that's perfect. That is exactly the kind of mindset that we're talking about. And it's this idea of taking control of your own destiny, right? And I'll just read the last part because that's the part that I like the best, but it says, it matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishment the scroll, I am the captain of my soul, right? So the idea is that you, each of you here, each of you watching the video online, has the power to define what it is you want to be and then actually be that, right? And so this I just thought was really cool because it kind of explains that, it defines that, and it gives us the courage and the ability to kind of take a stand and move in the direction of the things that we actually want in life. So hopefully that maybe makes you feel a little bit more confident about the things that you can do or what you're capable of. Let's talk a little bit about what that means here and now at Construct Connect in September of 2018. Okay, so there's a book that's called Dream Manager. Okay, if you've never heard of this book, if you go to like Amazon and read the description, it says it's a parable. It's actually based on a true story. So there was a company that was actually here in Cincinnati that wanted to motivate their employees and give them reasons to want to show up to work every day, besides just that they have bills to pay and mouths to feed and all that, right? So they came up with this idea that they would have a position added called a dream manager. And this was a person who was responsible for everybody in the company was encouraged to dream, just like we've talked about through this whole talk so far, right? Everybody was encouraged to dream, to find things that they want and to find ways to pursue them and to overcome the fears that have been holding them back from pursuing them for so long. And so they hired this person who they could go to who would help them, right? Help them get started, plot a course, define the things that they were afraid of and how to overcome them, step by step, move closer and closer until they actually achieve these things that they wanted to achieve. And so we here, so about 2 months ago, I felt like I needed to do more myself personally in terms of the contribution I was making to the world, to the people around me. And I was just trying to think of ways that I could do that, right? Chances that I could take to actually invest in people and help make things around me the best I can and help people achieve the things that they believe in. All this stuff is stuff that I truly, deeply believe in. And I just wanted to be able to do something meaningful. And so I actually sat down with Julie Storm. So if you don't know who Julie Storm is, she is the Chief People Officer. So she's the head of our people and culture team here. And I explained to her that, I don't know what that is. I explained to her that this was something that I believed in, and this is something that I wanted to kind of see if I could be a part of. And so she was like, okay, do it. And I was like, wait, what? And so it was kind of like, well, we don't have anybody doing it. So if you want to do it, then basically do it. So I've met with her a few times, and we've talked through some of the ways that we could actually make this a reality and what this looks like. And so the whole purpose of this talk was to introduce this and to set up this program that we're going to launch right now. So this will be something that's available to everybody going forward. And so we came up with a name, the Dream Quest. So it goes kind of along with this whole idea of slaying dragons and going on a journey and conquering our fears. And we wrote a mission statement. So it says, empowering Construct Connect employees to take ownership of and pursue their passions through investment in individual aspirations. Okay, so there are a lot of things in there that are kind of maybe buzzwords, but there were words that were used intentionally because this is what me personally, I actually truly believe in. And so things like empowering, hopefully this talk was maybe a little bit empowering. Hopefully you feel good about your ability to slay dragons. But it also is about taking ownership, right? So you as an individual can pursue the things that you want to do. And then investment. And that's the one that was the biggest for me when I sat down and talked to Julie, is that I want to invest in something more meaningful in my life than just, spreadsheets and Salesforce reports and processes. Although I love doing that. Hopefully, a lot of you have probably had experience with me doing that. And some of you have probably even sat through me training on really either of those. I've done Excel training and Salesforce training. I've worked with a lot of you on process improvement and all of those things. And I view that as an investment as well. The whole goal is to help make you all better at doing your jobs every day. So it's probably not super surprising if you know me that this kind of ties in as well. So the idea is that we can do, I can do more, and that I can be available to you all. So what we're going to do, and we can go ahead and go to the next slide, which is actually the last slide. So what we're going to do is, I'm kind of the owner of this thing. I'm the guy that's going to be responsible for helping everybody achieve their dreams. So you have my contact information here. You're welcome to reach out to me directly. You can email me. You can call me. That's my internal extension. If you go to the Loop, there are forms that you can actually fill out. So if you don't want to just reach out to me directly, you can go fill out forms. And you can apply. If you have a dream that you're interested in pursuing, then when you fill out that form, it'll actually send an email to me anyway. And we're going to work on helping as many people achieve things that they want to achieve as we possibly can. Just a few things on top of that. One is that I'm not going to be doing this completely alone, so I'm making it sound like I'm a one-man show. In terms of this talk and kind of getting this thing stood up, and in terms of being the person who's going to receive all of this stuff, I'm here for that because I want everybody to know that there's actually an individual who cares about helping you achieve your dreams and is going to be there reading your dream, and it's not just going to some inbox somewhere for some group of people that may or may not actually get around to it. So I can make that promise that I would do that. But what we're also going to do is have a network of coaches, right? So the idea, and if I could, I would go back to the hero slide, but we don't need to do that. But I mentioned the groundskeeper, and I mentioned Mick from Rocky. And if you look at those stories, there was always somebody. I mentioned Nala, right, that had to bring Simba back to the tribe. The stories all involve somebody helping them, right? You need some help. You need some accountability. You need somebody to help work with you, come beside of you, and help you get there. Even though we 100% believe people are capable on their own, it's just that much easier if somebody's there to help you and encourage you. And so I'm going to help and encourage as much as I can, but we're going to find people who have specific skills related to the dream that you have. So if you read the book Dream Manager, which is really short and easy to read, I'm not a very good reader. I've been reading the same book since January, and I'm like on the second to last chapter and can't get through it. And it's like 400 pages or something. So this book, the Dream Manager book, I read in like a week. So if that gives you an idea how easy it is, just pick it up, read through it. It's a pretty simple story, but you can see that, just kind of an idea of what some of the dreams were. So people that want to, buy a house or start their own business or lose weight or any of those things. There are people in this business already who are very good at those skills, right? I'm not good at any of them, honestly. But there are people who are. So we will find those people and we will connect you with the people who have those skills. And if you're one of those people, if you're somebody who wants to be a coach, if you're interested in investing in people, if you're interested in coming alongside somebody who's trying to accomplish something that they've never accomplished before but always wanted to, then there's a way to apply for that as well. So you can also reach out to me these same ways. If you go to the Loop, there's a separate application. So there's an application if you have a dream to apply for the Dream Manager program. There's also an application if you're a coach, if you want to get involved, if you're looking for an opportunity to mentor somebody, or if you say, here's some big thing that I've achieved in my life that was difficult for me, then you can apply, and then we'll connect you with somebody who's trying to achieve the same thing or something similar, right? So the idea is that we'll have a whole network, and it won't just be me doing all this on top of my day job, okay? So that is kind of the whole idea. And I just wanted to, I have a little bit of time. I probably have a lot more time if I wanted to, but I'm not gonna use more time than I have to. But I wanted to tell you, I told you at the beginning I would talk a little bit more about myself, and I've already done that quite a bit already. But just to kind of tell you some more about me, I tend to, if you spend time around me, you'll probably hear me use the phrase give a crap about people. I almost put that on here as my own mission statement. We had the Dream Quest mission statement, but my personal mission statement is to give a crap about people, which is like almost a joke, but it's really not. I mean, that's really what I want to do with my life is not, I'm not trying to change the world every day, but I'm just trying to impact the people who are right around me that I have the opportunity to do that with. And a couple other things that I wanted to show you, because I know that the whole dragon thing is kind of cheesy, and the whole idea of a talk about slaying dragons and all this. And I heard some of you talking about it when I was walking around the office and there were emails going out. I get it. But it means a lot to me because of what it means that we're all capable of doing if we actually set out to slay our dragons. So I just want to tell you a little bit more about that, and just to not necessarily prove to you, but just demonstrate to you that this isn't just like a shtick for today to make an interesting talk, assuming that it was interesting. So the first thing some of you have already noticed is my shirt. that says slay the tree cat snake bird. So now you all actually know what that means. So it's obviously a reference to the book that I mentioned before, and the whole idea of dragons being tree cat snake birds. You probably can't see it. If you were up too close in my personal space, there's actually a dragon on it. If you have really good eyes, you might see it. But there actually is a dragon on it as well, but it's black against a dark gray shirt, so it's hard to see. But that is something. But I have other props as well. So actually, my friend made me this. This is a crochet that says slay your dragons on it, with a dragon. If you've been to my desk recently, you may have seen this sitting there, but that's where that came from. Because the people who are closest to me actually know that this is not a joke, that this is actually something that I talk about quite a bit and something that I believe in pretty strongly. And her name's Emily. She's awesome, and she crocheted this for me, and I really appreciate it. Also, I didn't mention, this was a Christmas gift. So this isn't something I bought for today. This is something I already had long before I ever knew that any of this was going to happen. And then there's this, and there's one last thing I wanted to show you, and then I'll pretty much wrap up. And that would be my daughter's sword. So this is the actual sword you saw in the picture. It's actually kind of broken. It's a little wobbly. So she actually has a backup one that she sleeps with too. When she goes, I'm serious. I had to go. She lost it one time. And we were out and we were heading home, and she knew she was going to bed, and she said, I can't go to bed without my sword. And she knew it had been lost. So we actually had to stop at Target on the way home and buy a new sword to let her. This was like less than a month after the original incident. So it was still pretty fresh to her. But she stays at my parents or other places sometimes when my wife and I are going out or whatever. And I overheard my mom one time telling one of my brothers or sister-in-laws or something, when they were trying to put Caitlin to bed, like, yeah, she has to sleep with a weapon. So at my parents, she actually has a toy gun that she sleeps with. But she's pretty confident that as long as she has a weapon with her, she's capable of overcoming anything, even if they're plastic toy weapons, which also reinforces the idea that this is obviously imaginary, but so are the dragons and also the dreams, right? So it all is, it all kind of ties together. So with that, thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. And also thank you very much to Todd Cox. He's over here running all of this, making it work. So hopefully those of you watching are getting a pretty good experience, and that's all thanks to Todd. Also, thank you to Julie Storm, who obviously kind of allowed me to run with this crazy idea that I had, because I was pretty confident she was just going to laugh me out of the room and tell me to go do my job. But she didn't, and she gave me the opportunity to do this. So thank you to her. Also, Nick Samino, who's in marketing. There are some things that you'll see if when you get into the program that are kind of aids. Rather than telling you about it, I should just tell you what it is. It's a map, right? So if you decide you want to try to achieve a dream, be a part of the Dream Quest program, you will actually get a map that we will fill out together that defines your steps, and it looks like an old school video game with a castle in the middle, and you're actually going and slaying dragons along the way, which I think is pretty cool. Nick is 100% responsible for making it happen, so thank you to him as well. Which also reminds me of another thing that I was going to tell you about this sword when I had it. If you actually do the program and complete it and accomplish your dream, we're going to do a big ceremony. I'm not quite sure what it'll be yet. I told Julie we should do like a knighting ceremony or something. Because if you're going to be cheesy, you might as well just go all the way, right? So if you're going to do that, then you're going to hear this theme a lot, and we're going to just kind of play it all the way up. But it's not going to go unnoticed. It's not going to be just kind of a little thing that you do in your own corner of the office. We all want to celebrate with you. Everybody wants to be a part of all the dreams that everyone here is actually going to accomplish. So I really hope you sign up, and I hope that we can accomplish some pretty cool things. So thank you.